Hello, this is The Living Process, a series of conversations about working directly from experience in order to understand our human existence, especially using the method of focusing and focusing-oriented psychotherapy. My guest today is Jeffrey Morrison. Jeffrey is a very well-known focusing-oriented therapist living off the west coast of America. And he's very involved in teaching FOT to other therapists and is well known within our community for his work on psychotherapy. In this conversation, we talk about Jeffrey's journey from existential phenomenological approaches into focusing as a way of working with clients. We also touch upon his interest in trauma, and there's a recent chapter in a book on trauma that he co-wrote, and the reference for that is in the show notes. Jeffrey and I touch upon spirituality as an aspect of working from a focusing perspective, and also about death awareness and what that offers a person in their life. It's a very broad conversation. I found it really engaging. Near the end, we talk a little bit more about how focusing can help you stay in an in-between place and not have to align yourself with one point of view or another, but instead value the life process itself as it arises within anyone, no matter what their point of view might be. So I hope you enjoy this episode 28, with Jeffrey Morrison. Welcome back to The Living Process, and I'm very happy to have Jeffrey Morrison as my guest this time. Welcome, Jeffrey.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate it.
Yeah, nice to see you and to have you here. I have lots of questions, and I imagine we'll get into an interesting conversation.
It's great.
Yeah. What I like to start with, if it's okay with you, is just getting some sense of kind of your journey into the focusing world, how you discovered focusing, kind of how you developed it, that sort of thing.
Oh, great. I I think I'd finished college. It was about this time in 1982, maybe the very beginning of 1983. And I was living in the Pittsburgh area.
Hmm.
And I read something that talked about a focusing class, and I didn't know what focusing was, but it talked about the philosophy, the underpinnings of focusing, and it was taught by a graduate student at Duquesne University who was working on his dissertation in psychology, existential phenomenological psychology. And so I took this focusing class and learned the 6 steps of focusing.
Hmm.
And not only did I learn focusing, but we had some follow-up time where people he had been teaching got together and, kind of did an impromptu changes class. And then he let me know about a publication that was something like humanistic psychology programs in North America. And because I was looking for graduate programs, and the short of it is I applied and got into Seattle University, and so made it out to Seattle just a little over 40 years ago and began a master's program in the other school in the United States that offers a degree in existential phenomenological psychology.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't really until I started private practice in 2000 that I got serious about studying focusing. I'd worked in middle schools for a number of years, and I kind of knew it as a process and a few workshops here and there, but it was before the internet. I didn't really know how one pursued studying, focusing. And back in that day, it was kind of like, well, you learn the 6 steps and now you know focusing.
Yeah.
And but I got a focusing partner around 2000 and learned about Ann Weiser Cornell and what she was teaching. And I started studying with her in 2003. And I really appreciated that she kind of laid out kind of a series of workshops in a way you could learn and deepen the process. And went on for certification, was certified in 2006, became a coordinator in 2012 through Shirley Turcott. Um, so those two people been very instrumental in my learning. And then I would call Joan Klagsburn my focusing mentor, in that she really helped me, um, just supported me and encouraged me to develop my own training program.
Hmm.
And there were some things that I think she really helped fill in for me in terms of the world of focusing, and really feeling competent as a coordinator and developing a training program that was my own. And yeah, that's, I guess, the brief history.
That it immediately evokes a couple of questions for me.
Mhm.
One is, what was it that initially attracted you to that graduate student's philosophical introduction to focusing?
Ah,
Must have been something there that.
yeah, I kind of left that out, didn't I? See, undergraduate school, I was a philosophy and religion major.
Okay.
And I had several really good teachers, but my favorite was Howard Johnson. And I read in a really small little group of about two or three of us, Being in Time by Heidegger.
Mhm.
He was the religion teacher, but he also taught philosophy and um, uh, existential philosophy. And I think, those underpinnings of understanding that life is process have been very helpful. And so,
Mhm.
as he would say, things are ising along. And so when there was a description that described some of the philosophical underpinnings of focusing, those were familiar to me. Heidegger and
Mhm.
existentialists, um, and that there was this process that helped, put me in touch with my direct experience was, I think, really the key. Something that, I mean, I'd had lots of experiences, which really led me to studying philosophy and religion. When I first went to college, I think I was going to study business and economics, which didn't really work out. Um, but I found my way to kind of a combination of studying some psychology, but really in undergraduate school, the degree that fit me the best was a philosophy and religion degree.
Can I ask, your interest in process, was that also reflected in your attraction to theology?
Yeah, I mean, one studies the structure of things or the theory of things, but how do you how do you understand your direct experience, or by what process do you come or use? And I think at that point I had learned meditation, but it was just upon reflection and writing about experiencing and journaling, and to have a process where I can really context something like the felt sense and notice how that could open up and add meaning to experience and deepen it, was quite both insightful and impactful and something I was really drawn to, although I didn't quite know how to continue or deepen the process back at that point. That took a little while.
When I listen to you, I get the sense that you were looking for something.
Yeah, I think that's always, I mean, I wrote my first philosophy paper with my mother's help in like seventh grade on Plato. I mean, I was always interested in, how do we understand things? What is the meaning of life?
Yeah.
How do things work? And
Hmm.
I, we don't have, I didn't have much mentoring around that. There wasn't really a
Hmm.
particular spiritual sort of discipline or whatever that I was brought up with, just kind of the culture at large, which I found kind of thin and not very helpful.
Hmm.
Um, so I think for a while it was a little, just trying different things.
That resonates for me. It feels similar to my what was missing and what I was looking for from a young age. And also, like you, took me in the direction of existential phenomenological studies, partly because there was something that was very difficult to grasp there.
Hmm.
That
Yeah,
felt.
and I would credit things like, I mean, psychedelics were an
Mhm.
initiatory experience in terms of I think it really taught me about the implicit. Like in that experience, I could just trust my body sense of something. And I didn't have words or really a concept for that until I later studies, or learning focusing. But I think that put me in touch with experiencing in a different way that I didn't quite know how to grasp or explain. And
Mhm.
I think back in the day, I read, the Carlos Castaneda books and the Tales of Don Juan and things like that. But it was really my second college experience um, where I studied philosophy and religion and some psychology that really helped ground me for all of that.
Again, I could be projection, but I'm again getting this sense of uh, that in some way you are a seeker. You were looking for something.
Hmm.
And I'm curious when you were talking about focusing and the way you developed it, was there a kind of a thread you were following in some way in your development of focusing?
In my development of teaching it,
Oh, well, first of all, your development of
of
learning it
just
and
my,
taking it in for yourself.
I think that developed slowly.
Mhm.
I think being a seeker resonates and traveling. I did a lot of hitchhiking and backpacking and
Mhm.
crossing the country and but I think things developed slowly in terms of really understanding my own process and what that meant or how I would actually use this. Because at first it was just something kind of cool that I would learn more about myself, but it didn't quite have the depth and I didn't quite have uh, to say the control isn't quite right, but the means to really use the process in a deliberate, intentional way. And I
Mhm.
think once I had regular focusing partners and studied on a regular basis, then it began to make sense. And it really deepened and put me more in touch with myself and my own experience. I
Mhm.
mean, something I learned from Shirley Turcott was she really taught from her own experience.
Mhm.
And she has a big trauma story, and I mean, there's a big story there, and I don't have that kind of story, but it got me thinking, well, what is my story, and how do I understand myself, and what are my wounds and gifts, and
Mhm.
um, So then I started reflecting more on my own process because I knew I wanted to teach, and I knew that meant writing and speaking and all that stuff that kind of feels uncomfortable being a shy, introverted person. And I also had a daughter at the time who was struggling in school and was diagnosed with dyslexia. And I read, I was doing some reading on dyslexia, and I'm like, well, of course, this explains my struggles with education and how reading and writing were difficult, particularly spelling, but how that set up some, you know, reticence for really having confidence in my abilities to, teach. Being a teacher is something that I've really slowly settled into
Mhm.
because I think in part because of my struggles with education.
Yeah. It feels like jumping ahead, but it makes me want to ask a little bit about teaching. Um, I'm wondering when you teach focusing or FOT, either one, what kind of feels like the most important thing to you when you're teaching it?
Hmm. The most important thing for me as a teacher or what I am teaching.
If you were to tell someone who wanted to be a focusing teacher, if
Hmm.
you were to guide them, what you had learned was kind of the essence of it for yourself. I'm wondering what
Hmm.
you would say.
The essence of teaching is being able to hold the space and to really be present. And that's something that took some time for me to really grasp and feel comfortable with. That
Mhm.
really I'm communicating in a lot of ways. I'm communicating with how I show up and my body, so to speak.
Yeah.
So really to be able to hold the space and not like people want to see who I am, not just what I know or can tell them.
Hmm.
And then, of course, in the teaching of it is helping them make contact with their own felt experience and following that is the guide. And, the point isn't to become like Jeffrey Morrison or do things the way I do, but to really find
Hmm.
who it is they are and to bring that forward and to find their gifts and highlight those in working with anyone. I think as a therapist, the most essential thing is to be myself, that is what makes more of a difference than anything in terms of how I show up, hold the space, can I be present and real as another person?
Hmm.
And then there's all the things we do as therapists that can be facilitative, but it's really done with that spirit of um, improvisation, being experiential, putting nothing between, really following the response of the client.
Hmm.
And yeah, I mean, I think those are the basic things I highlight when teaching.
Yeah, I'm thinking that what you're saying is when you're teaching focusing, and maybe also when you're with a client, although there probably are differences in those two settings, that when you're teaching, you want to show the process that you're talking about. You want in some way to be it
Hmm.
rather than talk about some process that they go then and practice and they don't see it happening in you.
Yes. So, and I think that kind of points to I'm slowly reevaluating maybe how I teach a little bit. I mean, I do like, I think it's really, I like structure.
Yeah.
I want to see that there's a structure to the process to begin with. And maybe that's kind of like Gendlin talking about instructions are a rope across the territory. And once you have the territory, you don't need the rope. So I pretty much from the beginning teach focusing as a process and give some structure, but also reading of Gendlin's work
Mhm.
and really being able to point to the things that I think are important, that I can show my interest in that I can describe those, that I can demonstrate in classes, both as the listener and the focuser. I'm very comfortable focusing in front of people and to kind of give them all of that in little bite-sized bits, and really support their working with each other so that people always have a focusing partner, which rotates.
Mhm.
So they're doing the process, and the more they do the process, the more we kind of work with each other in class. And I do something called coach sessions, where it's at least three students with a coach or a facilitator. So they begin to watch each other as well as, be listener and focuser.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I think those are all ways that people kind of slowly absorb and learn and understand the process.
Yeah, I can hear that in the way that you teach structure, it gives some kind of containment for what otherwise can seem, if you stress focusing is purely a natural process, it can be more difficult to get a hold of it unless you have some little bite-sized instructions that help people kind of find particular aspects of it as they go along.
I absolutely, I learned focusing and you learn the 6 steps and now you know it. Well, I
Yeah.
didn't really know it.
Yeah.
And I mean, it worked sometimes and it didn't. And I went to workshops, and as time went on, they would hand out little handouts and then little manuals about what to do when it doesn't work. And these manuals about what to do when it doesn't work kept getting longer. And so, I mean, Ann Weiser Cornell had what I would call a developmental approach to the process, and I like that. And she had manuals,
Yeah.
and yes, you're working. You both have structure, and you're working with the implicit, which
Mhm.
doesn't have a structure. It's a relating with it. It's a process, and but to have both of those was helpful. And then, as you know, once we really get this, the instructions or that structure is perhaps less important. I think it's important for learners, but as you learn yourself, that becomes less of what one spends time with.
In my own teaching, first of all, I'm always shocked when people learn focusing. I think, where did you learn that from?
Yeah.
How did
Uh-huh.
that happen? Um, but there is, I think, as you're just describing this, very delicate back and forth between um, enough instruction that they partly unlearn and partly learn something fresh, and not so much instruction that they somehow lose themselves and the students get completely sort of oppressed almost by the anxiety of how to do it right, how to be a good listener, taking responsibility for the other person's process, all the things that come if technique or structure becomes too heavy. And finding that balance, I find with a process like focusing, it's there aren't a lot of processes or practices like this, I think, where that balance has to be so finely nuanced so that the person gets it and somehow doesn't lose the essence of it in the getting of it.
Yes. Yeah, I'm just thinking of, I mean, as soon as I start teaching them and giving them some structure, I start teaching them why the structure is kind of like they already, you can go beyond the structure.
Mhm.
That um, I'm helping give you some, you know, uh, signs or guideposts or that rope across the territory. But as soon as you kind of get that, that's great, hold on to it. But then that's just pointing to something more. And
Mhm.
it's the something more that I really want people to become curious about.
Yes.
And and so almost as quickly as I'm teaching them, I'm also teaching them how to break the rules and let go of the structure.
Yeah. I'd like to just go back. If for some reason it feels like it somehow fits here, although it doesn't sound like it, I'd like to go back to your mentioning kind of briefly about psychedelics.
Hmm.
And I'm curious, I also have experience with psychedelics, and it's been important in my life and positive for me. I'm curious to know sort of what did it give you, or you said it kind of broadened your kind of your experience of life in some way, or opened up your parameters. But was there something else that came from that?
Yes, and I'm not see how would I put that into words? I mean, it was really kind of a spiritual
Yeah.
sensibility that I
Hmm.
didn't have growing up.
Okay.
I mean, there was that seeker looking, trying to figure out, but it was that sense of really being connected to the world around me. I mean, I think,
Hmm.
psychedelics change how we filter experience and really orient our experiencing more toward our right cerebral hemisphere, which grasps the background and the holistic sense of everything and connection.
Hmm.
And that was a reliable way of understanding that a whole different kind of way of relating and understanding comes with that.
Hmm.
And that focusing is this process that kind of helps one do that naturally was kind of amazing
Hmm.
and kind of dovetailed in there very um, easily. And I really, the neuroscience I like to talk about with students to begin with is that of the right and the left hemispheres of our brain, and that some of this is a little stereotypical in that the left does all this, language, thinking, pattern recognition, movement. I mean, we can't live without that, but that the right hemisphere is is mapping the inside and the outside of the body and doing this whole background awareness. But it's not just running the organism, it's really sensing in a very different way, which is very subtle, nuanced, and takes longer to really be with sensation. And if we can do that and take that time, then there's a lot of information that comes there. It's much more symbolic, almost dreamlike. And if you stay with that, wow, there is this whole other way of knowing. And I mean, I think that connection is what people are missing in life, and that,
Hmm.
the world is a bit out of balance.
Yeah.
It really needs to be able, people need to be able to be in contact with themselves and the world around them because naturally, I think what comes from that is a wanting to take care of what's around you.
Hmm.
People, nature. It's hard when you see that you're a part of everything, that you're destroying things around you.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. There is um, compassion seems to be woven into our natural sense of self.
Compassion and connection. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, they're intertwined.
Yeah. Is the kind of what you were just describing in sort of neuroscientific terms, is that something you incorporate into your trainings?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, and I really appreciate Peter Afford's writing about this and Ian McGilchrist, who he studied and I've read about, and because I think it does a good job of giving it a bit of a neuroscience base, which a lot of therapists like because it's so important these days.
Hmm.
And it just dovetails with it's an another kind of way of explaining focusing and how the process works.
Hmm.
And yeah, there's a TED Talk by Jill Bolte Taylor who wrote, I think the TED Talk is my stroke of insight.
Oh yeah.
Um, and and in that TED Talk, so she describes as a brain researcher having a stroke, that she understands this is what's going on, and it takes her left hemisphere offline, and she's just kind of having this right hemisphere experience. And she describes basically a spiritual experience of being one with everything, melting into the floor, being warm, one with everything, and then also realizing that if she can't dial the phone, she's going to die. And she's able to do that after 45 minutes and lives to write about it and do a TED Talk. But I think that's there for us all the time. But we don't look for it. We don't,
Yeah.
I mean, meditators to some degree know this, but sometimes meditation can kind of be a dissociative process as well. It's really finding and working with that felt awareness and letting that unfold that I think is the deep richness of a focusing process.
I'm wondering, I mean, the that description of the stroke, it reminds me of a psychedelic experience.
Mhm.
And I'm wondering if you have ever found in focusing that you end up in a state that is reminiscent of a psychedelic experience. Not necessarily the more the kind of the sensations and the perceptual shifts and everything that happen, but more the sense of that right brain world where you
Mhm.
feel more kind of deeply in the present moment and your separateness from the rest of the world dissolves, that kind of experience. Do you get
Yes.
focusing?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there are sometimes in focusing where, it moves beyond working with an issue to just being.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Yeah.
and I guess we could say that like fully being present. And there is a sense of what I would almost refer to as mother energy, this warm, like mom shows up, and it's just this warmth, cared for, everything's okay,
Yeah. Yeah. Hmm.
expansive awareness.
Hmm. Yeah, definitely has that quality. It's like even thinking of death in that state, it's sort of like that also is absolutely fine. It's just really,
Absolutely. I mean, I think I know existential philosophy, and I mean, death is an advisor.
mm,
And certainly as I'm aging, I mean, every day I would say I think about death in some way, not in morbid ways or worried necessarily about my mortality, but just it's kind of ever present.
yeah,
And it adds such a richness to life, really, a preciousness.
yeah,
I mean, I think when I was young, you just think, oh, things go on forever. I mean, there's this thing called death, but and now there's like, oh, there's such a preciousness to relationships and relating and what I can do and what I want to accomplish still in life.
yeah. And for me, at least, an appreciation that human lives are in fact very, very short.
Yes. Yes, they are.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with what you said about death. For me, I think I'm at the point where I'm not only thinking a lot about death, but thinking about how to think about death.
Mm.
Because the different ways I think about it have a very different bodily response.
Mm.
Sometimes I contract, sometimes I expand, and I'm really noticing what way of thinking about death makes me feel more alive in the moment.
Yeah, I've been working with Russell Delman for a number of years,
Mhm.
who's studied with Moshe Feldenkrais and is a Zen meditator and was Gene Gendlin's focusing partner for a long time. And yeah, there's just an appreciation for, as he says, everyone you know is going to die before or after you. And we ponder questions like, what did your face look like before your parents were born? There's a continuity to life that I think is kind of hard to grasp sometimes.
Mhm.
There's so much that came before us and will come after us.
Mhm.
And that, um, I mean, I don't know if we are reincarnated or not. I'm kind of agnostic about that. But there is a continuation of sorts. Thich Nhat Hanh would say, well, you look at the child, and of course you see the parents and
Mhm.
you see the offspring. And it's there in some way already.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel very open to all of that and try to protect myself from falling upon any one interpretation of it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like treating things lightly
Hmm.
and being open-ended because, I mean, any definition of an experience or process then allows us to talk about it, but it also limits us.
Yeah.
And that there really aren't many answers. I mean, for some things, there are answers, but for human process and living, there aren't many answers. There's ways of relating.
Yeah.
There's ways of being with. Um, I mean, certainty kills creativity. I mean, it doesn't, I think that's going back to what psychedelics did for me. I think I was a rather kind of, it really helped me work with control. And I mean, there's aspects of control that are very helpful, but there's a lot that are very limiting,
Hmm.
as well as things like certainty and that need to know. Because if you can really be on that edge of not knowing, which itself it can trigger trauma because there's not knowing, there's instability, there's maybe a little shakiness. And our system, particularly our left hemisphere, doesn't like that. We're kind of wired to know and be prepared. And um, and yet to work with focusing in the implicit is to be in that not knowing space long enough where something new comes.
Yeah. Yeah. The way that when I talked with students, the way that I often say it is there's many answers, but no conclusions.
Yeah, I mean you can get to certain answers or going back to my teacher in college, Howard Johnson, he had on a faded piece of paper up on his wall, and some magic marker, it said, um, don't hitch your wagon to a star unless you need a place to park. So it's like, so if you reach a goal, great, but don't stop there, kind of keep going. And, sometimes you need to rest, but it's that life is process.
Yeah. It reminds me of something that J.M. Barrie said in one of his plays about hitching your wagon to a star. He said, don't bother trying to do that. Few of us have wagons and there are no stars.
So, yeah,
But can we just go back a bit because you just sort of
sure.
touched on it a little bit. I know that you've worked a lot with trauma, and I think it's a big part of your teaching.
Hmm.
I would really be curious to hear a little bit more about how you understand trauma and how, in a focusing way, you might work with it.
Sure. That's a big question.
Yeah, it is a big question.
You know, I'm, what do I want to say first?
Yeah.
You know, human beings have been around for a while. Trauma's been around for a long time. Ways of healing have been around for a long time. I'm a little disappointed where our field of psychology is now with, I'm on a email listserv and people will say, well, I'm looking for a referral for someone that does EMDR, which I think is code for someone that works with trauma, as if a protocol is
Yeah.
what's needed.
Yeah.
And so I like to kind of step back and have a big view or a wide angle view to begin with, which is, what is trauma for you? And I start the second year of my training program really focuses on trauma. And so we begin with wounds and gifts that, and I really like the work of Michael Meade, who's a mythologist and storyteller, happens to live on my island here, and I know him. But he wrote a very good book, Fate and Destiny. And, fate is what we're born into. It's the family we're born into, the setup in life. But that's not our destiny. Our destiny is finding that thread that lives through us and our experience, and really being our biggest, fullest self, which is there in some way and is also, of course, shaped by our choices, etc. But Mead says there's two kind of paths of initiation. One is the kind of initiation that is wounding, because assuming we don't die, or in process model terms, if we don't die, then we find a way around the stop process. But the way we find ourselves going around the stop process is a changed process itself. It shapes us, and so we have to encounter our strategies for getting through, or for getting through is maybe one, and then healing is another, because sometimes the strategies that got us through also become limiting.
Mhm.
But that it really, our wounds can open us to things we didn't know about ourselves. Um, and that's one path. The other is sometimes we just have experiences of awe or are touched deeply by the world, and that opens us to something. Although that kind of experience where we think, oh, that's great, I really like that, or that going back to psychedelics, like, woo, that's fun. But it can be rewounding in the sense that it opens us up in a way that is a huge challenge. And often we go, wow, yeah, that would be really cool, but yeah, not today. I'm not ready for that. And we go back to kind of being our smaller self. And and to work with both of those doorways, to work with mythology and stories about um, that put us in touch with the basic things like death and rebirth. Mead would say, put death in the middle of life. What is it that needs to die or be let go of in order to create space for something new to develop and grow? So
Mhm.
I really like mythology. There's stories from, history, thousands of years that teach us these things. Um, I think from Russell Delman, I've really learned embodiment. I mean, a lot of people like polyvagal theory and talk about dysregulation and this, that, and the other. I really think our physical body gives us a lot. And I really work with people to, let's just start with neutral sensation. Can you wiggle your toes? Can you feel your feet on the floor?
Mhm.
And to really, in focusing, I think we can skip over that pretty quickly and go into the feeling body, the situational body. But really to help people ground is very important. In terms of how I use focusing, um, I'm kind of with Gene. I do anything and everything.
Mhm.
And it really is amazing how different therapy with one person looks than another person.
Yeah.
And that I can adapt and bring in lots of different things that I have learned and I apply them. And I like doing family of origin work and having a genogram. And I,
Mhm.
like being able to get people up and move and do things. But to really help someone, and here's where I think working with trauma, it's hard to simply be client-centered. What I learned from Shirley Turcotte is it's client-centered but therapist-directed. That because trauma is speechless, you really have to guide and direct things at times. Lots of times not and very open-ended. But when someone is with something where they, are in the uncomfortable but safe zone where they can really be with and experience something,
Mhm.
which I think is critical. You have to have safety, but you have to be in that really uncomfortable where you're experiencing some of the trauma.
Mhm.
And to have someone there and to have them just follow kind of that or be on that line where they're not falling into dysregulation or not feeling safe,
Mhm.
but it's not so comfortable. They're just talking about something. I want them there and I want to be able to keep them there as long as it's doable to
Mhm.
really experience what they can. I think the felt sense is amazing in terms of like time travel. Like I see most client interactions in the present moment as interactions, but instances of past experience. So when someone is telling me about, for example, a client that I'd begun working with some years ago was describing current situations that had a certain feel and were overwhelming. And she got very dysregulated, saying, I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know. I don't know. Well, that kind of energy pointed to like, that's from something more than what she's just talking about. So I'll say, so is that just about the current situation? Or how long have you had that kind of feeling, that kind of felt sense in your body? Oh, that goes way back. Oh, forever. I mean, people do that almost instantly.
Yeah.
And I mean, unless it literally is just about the current situation. And it takes us right back to times in their life that we can enter through the felt sense and work with that specific situation. Sometimes it's a bit more global of a time, a period in life,
Mhm.
but it really takes us to the spot that needs the attention.
Yeah.
You're not just going fishing for information or trying to go through everything in life. Um, but it takes us to those moments and to those memories of that really need the attention. I saw a client yesterday, and in a focusing process, something came about her father who had died years ago. And I got a text message from her this morning about how healing that was. Like she had some further experience after our session of just feeling his love. And that was so nurturing to her because she'd lost him at a young age.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, I could go on, but I'll pause.
Well, I mean, what I'm really, I really like what you've said, and I really get a sense of your way of working from that. Um, and also, one of the things that stands out to me is that you're not working in a way that's theoretically derived. It's not like you have some supervisor that's reminding you of what the theory said should come next, and then you're going to your client and trying to make that happen. Rather, it's experientially derived. You're noticing where there's something, there's a doorway, and you're just saying, let's sort of linger at the doorway and see where it might take us, what might be on the other side of that. It comes from their process. Their process offers something that you then are experienced enough to notice there's an offering.
Yes. I mean, I guess I'm of a dual, as most of us are, understanding. I mean, I love philosophy. I love theories and understanding things. But when it comes to being a therapist, I, I I largely have not paid attention to a lot of other people.
Mhm.
I've really tried to pay attention to my own experiencing
Yeah.
and to try things with clients, of course, safely, ethically, but
Mhm.
I, I've wanted to be experiential. I've wanted to really sense, oh, with this person, maybe we can try this. And of course, with their consent. And of course, with the next client, that wouldn't make sense. So
Yeah.
it's not like I do the same thing with everyone because that wouldn't make sense. But
Yeah.
the relationship and that what Gendlin talks about, the interaction, really gives me, us, a sense of what's possible in any moment with the other part of the us, the client.
Mhm.
And that's where I would say I've learned a lot from Lynn Preston in terms of letting there be an us, that the client and the therapist can be changed in the process. And that's pretty special because I think most people work with the idea that, oh, I'm not going to change, but I'm changing the client.
Yeah.
And there's something very limited about that.
Yeah.
We had a lovely discussion in one of my classes. Um, I'm lucky enough to, in my second year program, have a woman who has a son that's in my first year program. And he
Right.
was mentioning something about a painting in his mother's office of um, it's two people in a little boat, a little sailboat, and it's kind of stormy. And so I brought it up with his mom, and she showed us in class this painting. But it really depicts these two people are in this little boat, this kind of stormy weather, and they're just kind of noticing each other. It's like you're in the same boat together and
Mhm.
you're going to be changed by the process. And if you can be open to that, it just brings so much more into how you work with someone.
Yeah.
I mean, so much of our work is relational and filling things in. And so if I can really bring myself in and work in that relational manner, I think I'm much more open to what's missing for the client and helping them kind of find that in a way that our work helps to fill in missing interactions that perhaps were stopped in childhood or
Mhm.
didn't occur or whatever.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, but there is, and I don't normally want to take this point of view, but I find myself taking it now,
Good.
is that in that boat, um, there is an equality because it's two human beings in process with one another. And there's also a distinction because, and this is what I feel less certain about saying, but I think it's true of you, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, um, is one of the people in the boat, the one that we're calling the therapist in this case, uh, hopefully, from my point of view, hasn't taken on working with other people as a profession, but is instead has said in some way to themselves, this is my way of living. There is something about life itself that I can't forget that I'm alive long enough to have some other kind of career. The fact that I'm alive is my career. And there's something about that openness and sort of being that inquisitive and the practice and the constant learning and unlearning involved in that kind of a life that then means when you're in interaction with someone else, it's a really different, hopefully, a different immediately before even anything is offered. It's a very different kind of environment that you're offering through your own presence than is usually on offer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because if it was,
Yes, yes to all of that.
yeah, if it was, so I mean, the reason that I feel I don't like to put therapists on pedestals in any way, and like I like to deconstruct all of that professionalism that we sometimes get sort of too enamored with. And yet, I have to admit that if you are working in the way that you're talking about, um, it really is a kind of a life practice. And it means you do offer something that's unusual in this day and age.
Absolutely. And I think, I've really limited the number of clients I work with in favor of much more teaching.
Hmm.
And it's just this gradual maturing and process of wanting to work with therapists and other healing professionals because if I help them, they can help many people.
Yeah.
But it really is this my own unfolding life process of deepening my own sensibility, spirituality,
Hmm.
that and I really see like I could talk about trauma for hours, but I think of practices for change, and focusing is such a lovely practice for change, and meditation. But there's many other kinds of things in which you, if you really show up for yourself, that's a practice. And so it is my showing up that is kind of what I'm sharing with the other.
Yeah, exactly.
And that I don't have a standard, oh, you should do the following things, or here are the tools of the trade. I mean, I have some thoughts, but it's really that unique kind of being with each person
Hmm.
that that is the mark, I think, of a good therapist, that you can pivot and
Yeah.
adapt and figure out. And yeah, it's a calling.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for whatever reason, it's called to us. And it's different. Maybe you want to say something about this, that it's different from just focusing.
Oh, yes. Um, well, yeah, that, from Gendlin, from looking at therapy, figured out, I mean, at first he didn't think he could teach something called focusing. And it took a while. And students kind of kept saying, well, this kind of way you want us to be with experience, can you say more about it? And so he did create focusing and steps, but it really came from the experience itself. And and we have this lovely thing called focusing that can be a taught process, but and I think it's important to teach that to therapists, and I do that in my training program, but it, then how are you going to use it? I mean, maybe Gene's, one of my favorite quotes is focusing and.
Yeah.
Like he would say, don't make a methodology out of focusing. Certainly I wouldn't want to just think that you're supposed to take a structured way of doing focusing and just drop it into therapy and call that focusing oriented therapy, which I think some people try to do. And I
Yes.
don't think that's very helpful. So if I can really embody focusing and then really work relationally with someone, I'll even step back. I mean, most people don't do listening very well. And listening is so connecting and is a self-experiential. And that's where the kind of felt senses they'll start to surface and we'll start to sense them because that connection allows it to start happening.
Hmm.
And that's where I can then point because I'm really watching people's bodies. It's like, oh, something just came there.
Hmm.
Can we just be with that? Or the client who's trying to describe something and gets frustrated and says, oh, I don't know, or I can't figure that out. That's great because you do know this, this, and this. And right there, something you couldn't find words. Let's just be there. And it's that kind of teaching and that way of being with someone that I think is beyond the steps of learning something
Yeah.
and the doorway into the experiential process. And that, you know, each person is going to need me to say that a little differently to them or work with kind of their sensibility
Yeah.
so that they feel safe and can find that.
Yeah. That is
Uh,
so true. It's just like with every client, every student that wants to learn this approach needs to learn it in a very different way and will hear only some of the things that you say.
mhm. And I found, and I work with quite a few focusers in therapy and have, and I find sometimes depending on kind of their relationship with focusing or how they've learned it, they kind of get stuck with it's supposed to be a certain way, or
Hmm.
there's a certain process that's supposed to happen, or what part is this, and I have to understand and label the part for, and it's like it's just energy. Just be with something, leave it open-ended, sense it and sense its direction or how it's wanting to unfold. And because you know, people can kind of get stuck thinking it's supposed to occur in a certain way.
Hmm. Yeah, it's really, as I listen to you, I'm just thinking to myself, how do you teach that? Because one of the things I think you're saying is actually it becomes very, um, I'm tempted to say it becomes a natural part of the person's relating.
Hmm.
And it's something like tuning into that invisible, unseen self that is trying to emerge, somehow really getting a very palpable sense of what that part of the person needs to have heard or needs to be said or whatever it is that's responding right to that in the client rather than to the client that's paying you and looking at you. In some way, it's a different client that you're sort of, if you can find a way to teach that tuning in, then I'm hoping it doesn't come with quite as much scaffolding around it.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think as you're saying that, I think of Gendlin's article, The Client's Client, and he
Yeah.
says, the client sitting before us is kind of a bad therapist, or
Yes.
they're criticizing themselves, they're blaming themselves, they're
Yeah.
suppressing things.
Yeah.
But there's that inner client that wants to speak up.
Hmm.
And that's the one we're responding to, or we want to at least make some of our responses directly to that.
Yeah, exactly.
And as we work with the client sitting in front of us, they will pick up on that. They will begin to relate a little differently to the one in there that's speaking up. And over time, that brings change.
Yeah, it's like they piggyback on the therapist's care for that part of themselves until they can finally feel it directly.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yep.
Yeah. Um, I wanted to just ask, I'm aware of time, so I just wanted to, well, there's a couple of things I'd like to ask still. One is whether you have any kind of vision for how you would like to see focusing oriented therapy develop in the world or in the world of therapy, or what you would see would be a next step that you would be happy about.
Um, yeah, that's a great question. Um, one is, and as we have talked, I think, and as we are working on creating a association for focusing oriented therapists.
Mhm.
And I think that gives us a little more identity and a little more encouragement for us to um, do research and write and talk about how we see focusing oriented therapy.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe we can develop some common, I mean, in the world of focusing and focusing oriented therapy, we each have to kind of reinvent our own wheel in terms of teaching. And I dare say the word structure, but I bet there's some common ways we can talk about teaching focusing oriented therapy that would be helpful so that people can maybe more easily find it and learn it and teachers can teach it.
Yeah.
Um, so there's maybe the structure piece. Um, and I hope we don't lose track of really some of the I think critical things that Gendlin has written about. Um, that we can really get that there can be more written. I think I would like to write more about, I think Gendlin wrote in a very process-oriented way, which when you read it, or maybe the student reads it, it's kind of like, what the heck is he talking about? Or what? So, okay, this is great, but what really is focusing oriented therapy? Well, we need to give it a little structure, but we really also need to write about the kind of process in ways that people can grasp.
Hmm.
And and that's both in the diversity of how it can be used and combined with so many different things, because really underneath is this way of listening and relating that should be fundamental in all modalities, really, of therapy. I mean, that's kind of a baseline of being able to listen to someone and respond to what is implied, what they're trying to convey. And then you use your techniques or modality, perhaps, in this case, focusing as an experiential process, and to name what is maybe the focusing process here and what is uniquely brought in, like this person adds this or that person adds something else. Um, because it's something I think is, and I think maybe one of the things we haven't really named and worked with is that it is, psychotherapy, the psyche, it's a spiritual process and practice, really, and not as in a religious or structured in that way, but that it really puts people in touch with who they are and who they are becoming, and that destiny piece of being our biggest self. I mean, Gendlin says therapy exists for the one in there, the
Hmm.
that becoming more yourself. And I see the general milieu out there as being kind of reductionistic and very protocol driven. And um, yeah, so I would hope that we can offer ways of going beyond that.
Yeah, as I hear you say that, I'm just thinking I absolutely agree with you. And I'm thinking one of the challenges is it really is quite countercultural at the moment,
Mhm.
the emphasis that you're describing.
It is, and yet I think we're talking about how people experience, and when I
Hmm.
talk to people that know nothing about focusing, I mean, they're trying to articulate something about their experience usually.
Yeah.
And even if it's a fear response to something, um, of course, we're wired to stay alive and survive. But that fear response, and this is one of the wonders of focusing, is if we can listen to what's underneath the fear, like, why are you wanting to stay alive?
Yeah.
Um, well, then that opens up a lot more. And and that's one of the hardest things in working with clients to begin with is really getting them to turn toward and be with and listen to their experience, because that very experience is the stuff that's been overwhelming and torturing them and they've been afraid of and they've been suppressing their whole life.
Mhm.
But if we can teach that, if we can help people realize that simply by listening to their experience, there's something in it for them. I mean, we have to give people a sense that we have to meet them where they are and talk about things that they want to know and and help them see that a process that we have can really help them. And maybe that isn't even called focusing. Maybe that's just called pausing and sensing or something kind of beginning steps of, oh, how am I feeling about this? Um, I think that reaches a broader swath of people. And yes, it is countercultural because our culture is reductionistic and it's exploitive and,
Mhm.
you know, well, people are interested in, you know, how they maximize their self-interest in the marketplace. And yeah, I don't want to offer that.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, no, no, nor do I. No. But it sounded to me as though you were describing three different avenues upon which, I mean, they don't need to be distinct, but different avenues that we could go down as FOTs. One is to broaden the appeal of this approach by calling it something like pausing and listening. It doesn't have to be confined within a therapeutic dyad or something. It can be broader than that. It can be brought into your life in all sorts of ways. That's more like focusing itself, I'm thinking.
mhm,
Then there is within therapy, the people that come in, as most clients do, most, in my experience, most clients come in because they have an issue. Something's troubling them or something's not right. And they're wanting the therapeutic change that will correct that, at least initially. That
mhm,
might not be what happens. It could be that something totally different happens that inadvertently also addresses the presenting issue. But that's within a therapeutic realm. Once they get the help they wanted, sometimes they leave. That's what they wanted. And then they go
mhm,
back to living the way, in some way, that they were, although probably not exactly the same, hopefully. But then there's a third thing that, in my experience, clients rarely come in seeking. And that
mhm.
is a much deeper personal development.
Yes,
That is, I think, what you're referring to as the spiritual aspect of FOT, where you might come in to address an issue, but in addressing it, you develop a whole different way of relating to life itself.
absolutely. And yeah, and yes, and obviously that doesn't happen with all clients. That's kind of it either shows up or it doesn't in some sense.
Yeah,
And or there's those that you begin to open things and they realize that that's a possibility.
yeah.
But yeah, and and of course I love working with those folks because you can really do that deep transformational work.
And as you were saying earlier, it also helps us develop ourselves.
Yeah, I mean it's renewing for me to work with someone going through that because
Yeah,
um
exactly.
I feel good as I see them change, but also I'm changed in the process. I mean,
Yeah,
because I journey with them.
exactly. And you come out of a session like that feeling more alive, not drained or something.
Hmm.
Is there anything else that you are passionate about or developing or would like to add
I probably could go on.
or dreading?
Treading. Well, there's that too. I think and maybe this is a little bit from something that was on the coordinators list yesterday or the day before, but and I've really learned this or been part of it from a client. We live in a very polarized world. And and everyone wants us to be, you know, are you part of that group or are you part of that group?
Yeah.
And and can we stand, if not alone, but in between? And what does that mean, or what does that look like? Um, because it's not that I don't have some very particular views about things. I do. But I don't want to be in the little bubble of echo chamber of my own, self-confirmation of my own biases.
Yeah.
I really do want to be able to listen to others. There are intractable problems in the world. And if we just get pulled into one camp or the other, then it's kind of a war with the other camp.
Mhm.
There's nothing really new comes from that.
Yeah.
And that if we're going to solve problems, almost the initial aspect of solving something is really a reiteration of the same things we did and the ways we've behaved that caused the problem in the first place. And the only way out of that is to be in some middle position, the you know the yes, no, right, wrong way of looking at things doesn't offer any freedom.
Mhm.
And so we need to feel safe. We need to feel embodied. If we're embodied, we can feel present. If we can be present, we can have the freedom to make non-habitual choices. And so I hope everything from the Institute itself, but us as focusers and individuals, that we can really work to stand in the middle. I don't have a other way of really saying that, but we hold out for further possibilities as opposed to a simple choice that cancels out someone else's perspective.
Yeah. I am totally with you on that, and I feel very relieved to hear you say that because I years ago I got involved with activism, and I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if as therapists we became activists and sort of tried to change the world, not just our clients. And then when it started to happen, I thought, oh no, this is awful because it's like, as therapists or as focusers, if all we can do is jump into one camp or another, just like everyone else, what is the point of being a therapist or being a focuser if we can't offer the world something different? So I love the way you articulated that in-between place that in a sense is non-aligned and thereby more fully engaged. That to me offers some kind of hope, and I appreciate that.
I'll just add a little piece. November 5th was my birthday.
Oh,
The election in the US did not go as I had hoped.
yeah.
I didn't even, I found out about the results in the morning because I went to bed early. And I think I just, put my phone down, came out here, meditated. And my son, who's in graduate school, he he's at Yale studying environmental management. He has a part-time job working in a greenhouse where they're studying plants. And he sent a picture. It was a sunny day. The greenhouse was all sort of lit up.
Mhm.
And he just said, the plants are happy this morning.
Mhm.
I mean, life goes on.
Yeah, exactly.
There's more than elections or this faction or that. And if our allegiance is to life,
Yes.
that's very different than allegiance to a political party or an ideology, or it has to be a certain way.
I love that. And our allegiance to the life in each person on either side.
Yes. I mean, because life is life, and that yes, it has to be to life.
Hmm.
with a big capital L.
Yes, whatever that is.
Mhm.
Yeah.
The living process.
Yes. And on that note, thank you very much.
Uh,
I I feel better off having had this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Very much appreciate it. And it's good getting to know you doing things like this.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, until next time.
Okay. Enjoy your dinner.
Yes, enjoy your breakfast. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.